The pre-dawn mist clung to the Ardennes forest like a death shroud on December 17, 1944. SS-Oberführer Klaus Weber stood atop his Tiger II command tank, watching the most elite armored spearhead the Wehrmacht had assembled sit in perfect, deadly silence. No rumble of engines, no clatter of tank treads, just the sound of his own breath forming clouds in the bitter Belgian air. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, 5,000 of Germany's most experienced Waffen-SS soldiers, all paralyzed by empty fuel tanks. Weber climbed down from his turret, his jackboots crunching on the frozen ground. Around him, his tank commanders emerged from their steel beasts like ghosts abandoning their tombs. Hauptsturmführer Hans Kruger approached, his face grim beneath his black tank beret. Herr Oberführer, Kruger's voice carried the weight of defeat. The reserve tanks are also dry. We have perhaps enough fuel for 10 kilometers of movement. Weber nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. 10 kilometers. They were supposed to punch through to Antwerp, 65 kilometers away, and split the Allied armies in two. Instead, they sat motionless in a Belgian forest, victims of mathematics that should have ended this operation before it began. Through the morning mist ahead, Weber could see the abandoned American positions. Smoke still rose from oil drums where GIs had been warming themselves just hours before. Coffee cups sat abandoned on makeshift tables, steam still rising from the black liquid. The Americans had fled so quickly they'd left their breakfast behind. But what Weber saw beyond the abandoned foxholes made his breath catch in his throat. Trucks. Hundreds of them? Maybe 500 or more, stretching back through the forest in perfect military formation. Olive drab American trucks, each one bearing the distinctive red ball insignia that Weber had learned to fear more than any Allied tank or aircraft. The Red Ball Express, the American supply system that had kept enemy armies fed and fueled across 600 kilometers of French countryside. Mein Gott, whispered Unterscharführer Otto Brenner, Weber's radio operator. It's like finding the Nibelungenschatz. But Weber felt no joy at this discovery. Something cold was settling in his stomach, something that had nothing to do with the December morning. As a veteran of 3 years on the Eastern Front, he had learned to read the signs of disaster before they became obvious to lesser men. Why would the Americans abandon such a massive convoy? Why weren't these trucks destroyed or evacuated? What kind of enemy could afford to simply walk away from hundreds of vehicles that represented more transportation capacity than most German divisions possessed? The answer to that question, Weber realized with growing dread, might change everything he thought he knew about this war. Everything he believed about Germany's chances. Everything he had been told about American industrial weakness. He was about to discover that his country wasn't fighting a war at all. They were participating in their own execution. Weber had spent the last 6 months watching the Third Reich slowly strangle on its own fuel lines. The synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Pulitz, once the pride of German industrial engineering, had been reduced to smoking ruins by Allied bombing. The Romanian oil fields, Germany's last reliable source of petroleum, had been overrun by the Red Army in August. By November 1944, the Wehrmacht was measuring fuel in liters, while the Luftwaffe grounded aircraft for lack of aviation gasoline. Weber's own Kampfgruppe had been allocated exactly 31,000 gallons for Operation Wacht am Rhein, enough fuel to travel 50 kilometers in combat conditions. Their objective was 65 kilometers away. The mathematics of failure had been built into the plan from the very beginning. We will reach the Meuse River by capturing American fuel depots, General Sepp Dietrich had announced during the final briefing at Tondorf Castle. Weber remembered the uncomfortable silence that followed. Every tank commander in the room understood they were being ordered to execute a plan that depended entirely on enemy incompetence. Now, as Weber approached the first abandoned American truck, he began to understand just how catastrophically they had miscalculated their enemy. The truck's engine was still warm. The fuel gauge read 3/4 full. Weber opened the driver's door and found a half-eaten chocolate bar on the seat, an unopened pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, and a letter from home postmarked just 2 weeks earlier, evidence of a supply system that could deliver mail from Kansas to Belgium faster than German messages traveled between army groups. Kruger was examining the truck's cargo bay. "Herr Oberführer, you need to see this." Weber walked to the rear of the vehicle. The canvas-covered bed contained wooden crates stenciled with markings he recognized: 5-in-1 rations, medical supplies, ammunition, 30 cal. But it was the jerry cans that made his hands tremble. 40 of them, each containing 5 gallons of high-octane gasoline, 200 gallons in a single truck. "Check the others," Weber ordered. As his men spread through the abandoned convoy, Weber did the mathematics: 500 trucks. If each carried similar loads, they were looking at 100,000 gallons of fuel. Enough gasoline to power his entire Kampfgruppe to Antwerp and back to Germany. More fuel than Army Group B had received in the past 3 months. The Americans had simply abandoned it. Brenner came running from deeper in the convoy, his face flushed with excitement. "Herr Oberführer, there's more, much more. There's a fuel depot beyond the trucks, thousands of jerry cans stacked like pyramids." Weber followed Brenner through the maze of abandoned vehicles. American equipment was everywhere. Radios that looked more sophisticated than anything in German inventory. Medical supplies in quantities that suggested casual abundance. Rations containing chocolate, coffee, and white bread. The Americans fed their soldiers better than German officers ate, but it was the fuel depot that stopped Weber's heart. 50,000 gallons, minimum. Jerry cans stacked 3 meters high, extending for 200 meters. The Americans had created a temporary fuel dump that exceeded the monthly allocation for an entire German Panzer division, and they had simply walked away from it. Weber found himself staring at shipping manifests scattered on the ground, blown about by the morning wind. Brenner, who had worked in his father's import business before the war, translated the English. "Shipped from Texas refineries to New York Harbor. Transported by Liberty Ship Convoy to Liverpool. Rail transport to Portsmouth. Channel crossing to Normandy. Truck convoy via Red Ball Express route to Forward Depot Stavelot." The fuel beneath their feet had traveled 6,000 miles in less than 6 weeks. From Texas oil fields to Belgian forests, crossing an ocean patrolled by U-boats, surviving Allied bombing raids on French railways, delivered by a supply system that operated with clockwork precision. Weber picked up a discarded copy of Stars and Stripes, the American military newspaper, dated December 15th, just 2 days old. The headline made his blood freeze. "New pipeline operational. Cherbourg-Verdun line delivers 300,000 gallons daily." 300,000 gallons. Daily. A single American pipeline delivering more fuel every day than Weber's entire Kampfgruppe would consume in the complete operation. "Herr Oberführer," Kruger's voice carried a strange note, "I've been examining the manifest. This depot, it's classified as Class 3B temporary supply point. This isn't even a major facility." Weber stared at him. "What do you mean?" "This is a temporary fuel stop for the American 99th Infantry Division, a minor depot, and it contains more gasoline than we've seen since Kursk." The implications crashed over Weber like an avalanche. If this was what the Americans considered a minor, temporary supply point, what did their major depots contain? How much fuel were they moving daily through their supply networks? How much could they afford to waste, to abandon, to destroy, rather than let it fall into German hands? Weber had commanded armor on the Eastern Front, where a single barrel of gasoline was guarded like gold, where tank crews siphoned fuel from disabled vehicles, where entire operations were canceled for lack of petroleum. He had adapted to a war economy where every liter mattered, where fuel shortages determined strategy more than enemy positions. Now he stood in a Belgian forest, surrounded by evidence that his enemy operated on a completely different scale. A scale that made German scarcity calculations irrelevant. A scale that suggested Germany wasn't fighting a peer opponent at all, but something far more dangerous, an industrial power that could afford to waste more resources than Germany could produce. The terrible mathematics were beginning to add up, and Weber didn't like the answer. Weber's hand shook as he held the shipping manifest, reading the logistics chain that had delivered this fuel to a Belgian forest. Behind him, his men worked frantically to refuel their vehicles, their voices carrying an excitement he couldn't share. They saw salvation. Weber saw something far more terrifying, proof that Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their enemy. "Brenner," he called to his radio operator, "get me Army Group B headquarters. I need to speak with Field Marshal Model immediately." While Brenner worked to establish contact, Weber walked deeper into the American supply depot. Each discovery deepened his growing horror. Medical supplies in quantities that suggested American field hospitals were better equipped than German base hospitals. Ammunition stockpiled with casual abundance. Rations containing luxuries, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, that German soldiers hadn't seen in 2 years. But it was the fuel that told the real story. Jerry can after jerry can, stacked with mechanical precision. Each container bearing production dates from the previous month, shipping codes that traced their journey across the Atlantic, lot numbers that suggested mass production on an industrial scale Weber could barely comprehend. Hauptsturmführer Kruger approached, his face pale despite the December cold. "Herr Oberführer, I've been calculating. Based on the shipping codes, this fuel was refined in November, shipped in early December, and delivered here by December 15th. The entire process took less than 6 weeks." 6 weeks, Weber repeated, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. From Texas oil fields to Belgian forests in 6 weeks. "There's more," Kruger continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I found maintenance logs from the American trucks. They're recording daily fuel consumption of 40 gallons per vehicle, per day, for routine operations." Weber did the mathematics instantly. 40 gallons per truck, per day. His Tiger tanks, the most advanced armored vehicles in the Wehrmacht arsenal, carried 860 liters, roughly 227 gallons of fuel. The Americans were burning nearly a full tank of Tiger fuel daily just to keep their supply trucks running routine operations. "How many trucks in the Red Ball Express?" Weber asked, though he dreaded the answer. "According to these manifests, sir, 6,000 trucks operating continuously." 6,000 trucks, each burning 40 gallons daily. 240,000 gallons consumed every day just to run the American supply system. Weber's entire Kampfgruppe had been allocated 31,000 gallons for their breakthrough to Antwerp. The Americans burned 8 times that amount daily just to keep their logistics network functioning. Brenner's radio crackled to life. "Herr Oberführer, I have Field Marshal Model's headquarters." Weber took the handset, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "This is Weber. I need to report our fuel situation and discoveries." The voice on the other end was crisp, efficient. "Report your status, Oberführer. We have secured American supplies at grid reference 348-576, significant fuel stocks, approximately 50,000 gallons captured. A pause. Then, "Excellent news, Weber. This changes our operational parameters significantly." Weber closed his eyes. "Sir, I need to report additional intelligence. The Americans, their supply capabilities appear to exceed our estimates." How could he explain? How could he convey the psychological impact of standing in a depot that represented more logistical capacity than entire German army groups possessed? How could he describe the casual abundance that allowed Americans to abandon hundreds of trucks, thousands of gallons of fuel, supplies that would have been strategic assets for the Wehrmacht? "Sir, the Americans abandoned this depot without destruction. No demolition charges, no attempts at denial. They simply walked away." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you suggesting they intended us to capture these supplies?" "No, sir. I'm suggesting they can afford to lose them. This appears to be a minor supply point for a single American division, and it contains more fuel than we allocated for this entire offensive phase." The silence stretched on. Finally, "Weber, continue your advance as planned. We'll analyze your intelligence reports later." The connection ended. Weber handed the radio back to Brenner, understanding that his superiors couldn't process what he was trying to tell them. The scale of American logistics capabilities was beyond German comprehension because it operated outside their framework of scarcity-based warfare. Weber walked to the edge of the depot, where his men had discovered something even more disturbing: a pile of discarded Stars and Stripes newspapers from the past week. Headlines that painted a picture of American industrial might that defied belief. "Liberty ship production reaches 3 vessels daily. Aircraft factories exceed 1,944 targets. 96,000 planes produced. New Texas refineries boost oil production to record levels." Unterscharführer Brenner was translating another article. "Sir, this discusses their petroleum pipeline system. They've constructed underwater pipelines across the English Channel, something called Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, delivering 1 million gallons daily from Britain to France. 1 million gallons daily through underwater pipelines." Weber thought about Germany's fuel situation. Synthetic plants bombed into rubble, Romanian fields overrun, German divisions rationed to liters per day. Meanwhile, the Americans had constructed underwater petroleum pipelines as casually as German engineers built field telephone networks. "There's more, sir. They have multiple pipeline systems operating across France. This one mentions the Cherbourg-Paris line delivering 800,000 gallons daily, the Seine line moving 650,000 gallons. Weber was no longer listening. The numbers were beyond his ability to process. He was a veteran of 3 years of mechanized warfare conducted under strict fuel rationing. Every operation had been constrained by petroleum shortages, every tactical decision influenced by fuel conservation. German tanks operated in single file to minimize consumption. Engines were shut off during halts longer than 5 minutes. Fuel was measured, hoarded, fought over, and now he stood in evidence that his enemy operated with such petroleum abundance they could construct multiple pipeline networks, maintain continuous supply convoys, and casually abandon depot sites that represented more fuel than German army groups received monthly. The psychological impact was devastating. Weber had believed, as every German soldier believed, that they were fighting a war between relatively equal industrial powers. German engineering was superior. German tactics were more sophisticated. German soldiers were better trained. These advantages could overcome American numerical superiority. But this wasn't about numerical superiority. This was about fundamental resource abundance that made German calculations irrelevant. The Americans weren't just producing more tanks, aircraft, and fuel. They were operating on a scale that rendered German scarcity meaningless. Weber's aide approached with the final piece of the puzzle, a logistics manifest from the abandoned American command post. Sir, this documents fuel allocations for December operations. The U.S. First Army alone has 3.5 million gallons in reserve. For a single month, 3.5 million gallons in reserve for routine operations. Weber's Kampfgruppe, the spearhead of Germany's last great offensive, had been allocated 31,000 gallons for their decisive breakthrough operation. The Americans maintained more than 100 times that amount in routine monthly reserves. The mathematics were beyond devastating. They were incomprehensible. Weber realized he was looking at evidence of an industrial capacity that Germany had never possessed, not even in 1939, when their war machine was at its peak. The Americans were conducting warfare with resources that exceeded Germany's theoretical maximum production by orders of magnitude. As his men finished refueling their vehicles, Weber understood that this discovery would change nothing. 50,000 gallons would power their advance for perhaps 2 days. Then they would face the same fuel shortages, the same logistical constraints, the same mathematics of scarcity that had been strangling German operations since 1943. But the Americans would continue, operating with pipeline networks, delivering millions of gallons daily. Supply convoys that burned more fuel for routine logistics than Germany allocated for strategic operations. Industrial production that could afford to waste more resources than Germany could produce. Weber climbed back onto his Tiger tank, giving orders to advance toward Stavelot. But as his Kampfgruppe moved deeper into Belgium, he carried with him the terrible knowledge that Germany wasn't fighting a war anymore. They were participating in their own systematic dismantlement by an enemy whose industrial capacity operated beyond the German understanding of warfare itself. The fuel they had captured was meaningless, a rounding error in American production, a temporary reprieve before the inevitable mathematics of industrial warfare reached their final conclusion. His Kampfgruppe approached the major American fuel depot on December 20th, their captured gasoline nearly exhausted. Through his field glasses, Weber could see the prize, over 2 million gallons of fuel stored in a depot that sprawled across 15 acres. Enough petroleum to guarantee reaching Antwerp, enough to validate the entire offensive. Then he watched American engineers calmly destroy it all. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received simple orders: deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. Weber watched in fascination and horror as white phosphorus grenades ignited gasoline trails between massive fuel stacks. Within minutes, 2 million gallons, more fuel than Weber's entire army group had possessed since Normandy, became a pillar of fire reaching 1,000 feet into the Belgian sky. The Americans could afford to burn more fuel than Germany could produce. Weber's radio operator intercepted American communications during the destruction. Phoenix Base, this is Fuel Depot 7. Initiating denial procedures on 2.2 million gallons. Resupply convoy already en route with replacement stocks. Replacement stocks already en route. The Americans were destroying strategic quantities of fuel while simultaneously dispatching replacements, as casually as German units might replace expended rifle ammunition. That night, Weber received intelligence reports from across the Ardennes front. American engineers had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk German capture. 8 million gallons, more than Germany had allocated for the entire offensive. The Americans had deliberately burned what the Wehrmacht would have guarded with entire divisions. The psychological impact spread through Weber's command like poison. His veterans, hardened by 3 years of Eastern Front combat, were not demoralized by American firepower or tactics. They were broken by American waste. Soldiers who had fought for individual jerry cans watched enemies burn millions of gallons with casual indifference. Untersturmführer Brenner found Weber staring at the burning depot. Flames reflected in his eyes. "Sir, the men are asking questions about how the Americans can afford such abundance." Weber nodded slowly. The questions were inevitable. How could the master race struggle for every leader while their decadent enemies burned oceans? How could German industrial superiority produce such scarcity while American weakness generated such abundance? The racial theories underlying Nazi ideology couldn't explain American petroleum pipelines or industrial production statistics. By December 23rd, Weber's vehicles were immobilized again, this time permanently. The mathematics of fuel scarcity had reached their logical conclusion. 39 perfectly operational tanks abandoned solely for lack of gasoline. Weber walked among his disabled armor, ordering demolition charges to prevent capture. Million Reichsmark vehicles destroyed by empty fuel tanks. The final irony came during his capture by the American 30th Infantry Division. Major Robert Harrison, processing abandoned German equipment, needed just 8,000 gallons to recover Weber's entire tank force. Minor requisition, Harrison noted in his report. Source: local reserves. Processing time: 4 hours. What had been impossible for Germany, 8,000 gallons to save their best remaining armor, was beneath American administrative notice. A routine request using local supplies, processed faster than German paperwork for a single jerry can. Weber spent 11 years in Allied prison camps, returning to Germany in 1956 to find a nation that had forgotten the war's industrial lessons. In 1967, he told historian Dr. Heinrich Müller, "We discovered at Stavelot that we weren't fighting Americans. We were fighting American industrial capacity. Every gallon they burned, every pipeline they built, every convoy they operated demonstrated that our scarcity calculations were irrelevant to their abundance mathematics. The lesson extended far beyond World War II. In industrial warfare, production capacity supersedes tactical brilliance. Abundance defeats dedication. Logistics overwhelms courage." The German soldier of 1944 was arguably better trained and more experienced than his American counterpart. It didn't matter. Americans were supported by petroleum pipelines, supply convoys, and production statistics that rendered individual excellence meaningless. Today, Weber's Tiger tank sits in the Museum of the Battle of the Bulge at L'Église, positioned exactly where it ran out of fuel on December 23, 1944. The fuel gauge still reads empty. Visitors often ask tour guides why such powerful tanks were abandoned intact. The answer is always the same: no fuel. But the deeper truth, the lesson Weber learned in that Belgian forest, remains relevant for any nation contemplating conflict with an industrial superpower. Wars between modern states are won by refineries and factories, not by courage and tactics. The side that can afford to waste more than their enemy can produce has already won. Weber's discovery of American abundance at Stavelot revealed the war's outcome had been determined not by battles, but by production statistics. Germany never had a chance once American industrial capacity mobilized. The mathematics were always insurmountable. What other moments in history have revealed the true nature of industrial warfare? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II's most decisive encounters. The next video explores how a single American factory outproduced the entire German aircraft industry, and the Nazi officials who tried to hide this terrifying truth from Hitler himself.